Hey y'all, I'm Karen Mayer Cunningham, the special education boss. If you've ever felt confused, overwhelmed, or just plain frustrated at the 504 IEP table, you are in the right place. Every week, I'm breaking down the rules, the rights, and the realities of special education so you can walk into meetings informed, empowered, and ready to make real change. And whether you're a parent, a teacher, an advocate, a school-based member, or somebody who's just trying to do right by a student, this podcast gives you straight talk, real answers, and tools that you can use immediately. I'm not here to play politics. I'm not here to play sides. I'm here to train people who sit at the table and teach you how to follow the law, ask the right questions, and protect the rights of students. So go ahead and hit subscribe, share this with a friend, and you know what? Meet me back here every single week. We're not just talking about change. We're making it. Because when you know better, you do better. And when we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody. Hi, welcome you guys. Thank you guys for being on. Remember, if you have questions and you want to get them answered, just reach out to us at advocate@specialeducationacademy.com. If we haven't met, I'm Karen Mayer Cunningham, special education boss, training everyone who sits at the 504 IEP table to navigate and negotiate successful student outcomes. We're so excited that you're here today. And we're talking about IEP goals. I think for the people that I train, for school-based members, it's sort of like this big problem for people that don't know how to write IEP goals. And it's really quite simple. We're going to talk about what is an IEP goal, what are the types of IEP goals, and then how do we construct them? And certainly we have more in-depth trainings, which Alicia can get you information on the Academy. And we even have some on YouTube that we can help you with. But we want to tell you how to write IEP goals. An IEP is individualized education plan, right? And the IEP goal is that thing that we are attached to monitor data progress, and it's going to change a kiddo's life, right? We have one goal in special ed. It's just one goal. Let's simplify it. And here it is. Our job in special education is to teach a child with an individual, teach an individual with a disability between the ages of 3 and 22, a strategy or skills to self-manage their disability in that area. So we're certainly not trying to make something go away. We're teaching them skills to mitigate it. So I have strategies and things that I do all the time. I am a sea of Post-it notes. I have pads everywhere. It helps me learn. That's my learning modality. It's a strategy. Without that strategy, I wouldn't be as successful at things. And so this is just another thing that we're doing. So special education is not a dirty word. It's not a bad thing. It's not something that we suck air through our teeth when we're trying to tell people not to have it. It's an ability to teach a child a skill or a strategy. Both of my sons were and are professional athletes. And so when they were in school, we paid for private coaching for my son who's a professional bowler and my son who's a professional runner. Nobody would say, oh, Karen, why are you getting coaching for the boys? Because the public school was great, but it wasn't enough to get them to the skill level they needed. And so special education is really just coaching. That's the way I see it. So we love general ed teachers, and there's lots of them on there, but it's not enough. Some kiddos need more to master and gain those strategies or skills to self-manage their disability. So let's talk about what IEP goals are. So when you're sitting in an IEP meeting, you're going to write annual IEP goals. And that annual goal is usually for 36 instructional weeks. So kids don't start special ed the day school starts and it's over the day school stops. So 36 instructional weeks, let's say that your child starts special ed November 5th. Then their annual goals are going to go from November 5th, 2023, and then they will stop at November 4th, 2024. So it covers 36 instructional weeks, which is going to be a year, but that year starts at the date of the IEP document. And so what are IEP goals? So again, they're to mitigate the impact of their disability. Want to caution you and remind you, lovely friends everywhere, attorneys, advocates, school-based members, parents, we don't talk about an academic need. Just stop saying that. That is not what the law says. The law says that we identify, locate, and evaluate children who may be in need of special education related services, and we assess them. And based on this assessment, if we find a need for special education, then we write these annual IEP goals. If there's an educational need, say it with me. Is there an educational need? Alicia and our partners and all the advocates that I work with and myself, we have plenty of children who have special education eligibilities and have zero academic goals. They have 0 academic goals. They might have an orthopedic impairment and a speech impairment. They don't have any academic goals. So I want you to lean in and listen to, whether you're a school-based member or a parent, when somebody says, oh, you can't have special education because they have A's and B's. That's fantastic. But a student's need is outside of the scope of just academic goals. So let's talk about the kind of goals that you could have. And if you're taking notes, and I talk fast and I only talk faster, take them down or go back and listen to this 1,000 times. So annual goals, number one, behavioral goals. So again, this goes back to testing, and we have training on testing. If you need to know about testing, go back to that. But we all have behaviors. I have behaviors. You can ask Alicia. If you made me not use my hands, it would be a short webinar. I talk with my hand. It's a behavior that I have. Now, if that behavior impeded my learning and the learning of others, then we might need to write a goal around it. So let's think about that. And that comes from LRE, which the law says is the extent of non-participation. But as it relates to a need, we're talking about something that impacts them and others' learning, right? So it impacts these things that we're writing goals around, impacts their learning and or the learning of others. Impacts their learning and or the learning of others. So those are the things that we're going to write IEP goals around. It's quite simple. So behavior goals. So I have kiddos that have autism, have an emotional disturbance, might have ADHD. So they have behavioral goals. It doesn't mean they're misbehaving. I love when somebody says, well, they don't need special education because they haven't been to the office. Well, if going to the office was a need for special education, I would have had an IEP in the 70s. God bless all my teachers and principals, right? So going to the office doesn't mean you need a behavioral goal. And not going to the office doesn't mean you don't need a behavioral goal. So what are behaviors? So here are some simple ones, really simple. So it's very important when you're talking about IEP goals that you got the information from the school-based members. What does a student's disability look like across settings? And as I always say, what does it look like bell to bell, or sometimes bus to bus, right? What are those behaviors that I would need to address? So very simple. There's 3 major ones I want you to think about. Does a child have a trouble initiating? Does a child have a trouble initiating a task, a requirement, a directive? Does he have trouble initiating? Do you have to prompt him? Do you have to remind him? Do you have to encourage him, right? Do they have trouble sustaining? Does a child have trouble sustaining to the task that you gave them? Maybe because, and the because could be a million reasons, right? The task is too hard. It's too high academically. It's too long. They're not following the steps. And number 3, completion, right? So attending, sustaining, and completing are 3 great types of behavioral goals. We want to work on these behaviors, his inability to sustain a task, to complete a task, or to initiate tasks would impact his learning, correct? And so those are types of behavioral goals. Obviously, we have behaviors that can be, for lack of a better word, seen. The great Alicia was an amazing self-contained behavior specialist and teacher. And so her kiddos were greatly impacted by their disabilities, and often their behaviors you could see, right? But we want to make sure that we're writing an IEP goal to address their behavioral needs, okay? Next, annual goals are functional goals. Functional goals. What are functional goals? My ability to get dressed, or for some kiddos, our ability to stay dressed, right? Maybe I pull my hair. We have some kids that pull their hair when they're focusing or working, or they pull it so hard it actually comes out. I had a little girl that I advocated for that I think went on to be the salutatorian, maybe even the valedictorian, and she was gifted, and I got her in special ed. Now, they were not happy about this. But when she worked, she was so high cognitively, she would pull her eyebrows out. So that's impeding her learning or the learning of others. These are things that we want to teach her a strategy to not do that, right? We're looking at behavioral needs, functional needs. They're outside of the normed range. Just remember that. Is this area outside of the normed range? Okay, functional goals. So it could be how I'm holding a pencil grass. It could be attached to a related service of occupational therapy or maybe physical therapy. So what are those functional needs? You're ambulating, your ability to get through the building, to walk through the building, eating. Let's say that your child has a food issue. So we might have them have a dysphagia evaluation. I have kiddos that pocket food. They keep food in their little cheeks, or when they eat, they gulp so fast, or they make themselves choke. So those are functional needs, and you would write a functional goal around those. Okay. Next are annual goals, academic goals. And so obviously it's pretty easy to identify an academic goal. The academic goals are only going to be in 5 areas. They're only going to be in 5 areas. What would those 5 areas at the most be? They would be the 5 core classes, right? Reading, language arts, math, science, and social studies. But usually you just have those first 3, reading, language arts, or math. And when you get to high school, you're down to reading and math, because language arts goes away in 8th grade. But of course, we know that reading and math is going to affect any area. You're not going to have an academic goal in classes that are not your core classes. There's not an academic goal for welding. There probably should be, right? It's not an academic requirement. So those 5 are what you're going to have academic goals around. And of course, in the present levels in the testing, we've identified in these academic areas that there's an identified deficit, that we are not in the normed and average range. So Karen, what rises to the level of having an academic goal that they're just struggling in math? So I don't want a kid to be struggling in anything. When a child is 1.5 years behind in something, especially as it relates to reading, language, arts, and math, you better lean into that. Probably most of the people on here are school-based members, which we love that. We're honored to teach them. It doesn't go away. It's not something you're going to grow out of. It's not something that you're going to mature. If you have a reading deficit, I've got a 2nd grader who's a year behind in reading, that is a huge problem. And here's another thing that we don't say to parents, and I know that we mean well. God bless school-based members. They changed my son's life and every kiddo that I've ever served. But stop saying, we're going to write this IEP, we're going to write these IEP goals, and we're going to do this. We're going to close the gap. No, ma'am. No, sir. Stop saying that. We do not close gaps. I have been wearing glasses for 21 years. When I first started wearing glasses, the strength that I needed was much less. Is it getting worse over time? Yes, but this is a strategy that I use to help me see. So stop saying to people that we are going to close the gap. We do not close the gap. We don't do that in special education. So those academic goals, reading, math, and writing. And if they don't meet an academic goal, then don't write an academic goal. Well, they're struggling to pay attention in science. Okay, that is not an academic need. What kind of need is that? That's a behavioral need. So it's really important when we're sitting at the IEP table that we talk out, what does the disability and or the medical conditions look like across settings? We have a very detailed training on how to write present levels, but you have to ask these questions. And we sit at meetings and somebody slides the paperwork across the table. And I love good paperwork slid across the table, but I'm going to have a conversation and say, hey, Alicia, how's that going? Hey, Bonnie, how's that going? Hey, Kristen, how's that going? Hey, Luke, how's that going? Tell me what his disability looks like during cafeteria time. What does his disability look like during transitions? What does his disability look like between tasks inside of the room, right? He's loving math stations, and then you make him stop. He may not like that. So any of that, the playground, we want to look at the measurement to see if it's out of the normed and average range. Again, so academic goals. Okay, next are language goals or communication goals. Language goals or communication goals. Again, 2 different things. So language, which would be when you identify a student who has a speech and language impairment that can meet any of the 9 areas. We talked about that last week on eligibilities. You can go back and look at that. So those are language needs that are going to be initially addressed by an SLP, a speech and language pathologist. And then, of course, we're going to work on GMF, generalization, maintenance, and fluency in the classroom with the school, the special ed teacher, the general ed teacher, and the paraprofessionals serving that student. What are those language needs? It could be prosody, it could be voice, it could be cadence, it could be stuttering, it could be volume, it could be expressive, it could be receptive, pragmatic. There's many of them, right? Communication goals are different. I might have a communication need that when I talk to you, I'm 1 inch from your face. So that's not a language need, but it's certainly a communication need, right? I'm going to need to teach a child strategies to self-manage that, right? And teach them what is appropriate communication style. right? Do I stand close to somebody? If I walk up to somebody and they're crying, my response probably shouldn't be, did you see my trains? Right. So we can teach children communication. We can teach children any of these things, right? Somebody taught me algebra, allegedly. I can teach a child any of these areas of need. So communication goals, communication could be between parents, could be between peers, could be how do we communicate when what I want is not happening, right? Do I scream out in the room, or do I use other strategies? Do I use my card? Do I take a break? And we can teach a child how to successfully communicate based on their area of need. Next are going to be emotional and social goals. Again, these are two different things as well. So what are emotional needs? There are kiddos that have great emotionality. They don't have a natural or normed response under normal stimuli. And so we need to give them better responses. I have some kiddos that just, they're yellers when they don't have the outcome that they're anticipating or expecting. Or we have kids that talk so low you can't hear them, or they don't talk. They have other needs. They regress and go inside of themselves and retreat. So we want to teach them what is the normed and average range of emotional response in your daily life, to the bus driver, to the volleyball coach, to the cafeteria lady, to your paraprofessional that's helping you change classes. What's the appropriate emotional response, right? And then next are social goals, right? We have kiddos who, and Alicia had them because she had lovely behavioral kiddos that might have been greatly impacted by their autism, and they loved recess, but they would go and play by themselves. And while I had somebody on the great TikTok say, well, being an introvert is not a disability. I didn't say it was a disability. What I said was, when you go out and are at recess, that's a great teaching moment, right? This is how you play with other kids. A lot of kids, whether there's a disability or not, if they were only children, they don't really naturally know how to play with other children because it wasn't modeled at home. And so I don't want kiddos who have an opportunity once a day, to have recess, to miss this opportunity to have social interaction when there's not a work demand, where there's not a be quiet demand, where there's not a pay attention demand. And so we can have social goals that occur in the playground. We can have social goals that occur inside of a classroom setting. We can have social goals that occur inside of a social skills group that might be led or facilitated by a SLP or the school counselor. We can have social goals that are facilitated at, I call it the lunch bunch, right? My favorite class in school, eating and talking. So any of those that are needs, we can write IEP goals around this. I hope this is helpful, that we get to start thinking about, instead of, okay, he's got dyslexia, he's got 2 reading goals, we'll see you next year, right? So maybe based on the acuity of his dyslexia, he is greatly emotionally impacted by his inability to read, right? So we got to dig a little deeper than, the eligibilities. Next are related services. So under Child Find, it says we evaluate kiddos who are in need of special education and related services. And the related services list is exhaustive, but it could have everything from speech, language services, to physical therapy, to Braille, to counseling as a related service, to in-home parent training, to parent counseling, which is one of the first related services under IDEA. If a parent has a child with a disability, they're allowed to actually receive counseling themselves based on what is it like, their experience to have a child with a disability. So many services that are available: ESY, extended school year services, transportation. It's really important that you know what these related services are, so that they can have the most appropriate IEP written for them based on their, as we say in the law, their unique circumstances. We also have instructional services. That's only in Texas, because of course, Texas, we couldn't be like the other states. So we call them related or instructional services, and they are the same thing. And so those are the different types of annual goals. Now, those goals might be used also for ESY, extended school year. If a student does not make, that has documented regression on IEP goals with a profound amount of time to recoup them, they might be eligible for ESY, extended school year services. Or if we have a student that we're concerned for loss of critical skills, then that must be considered as a second criteria as well. So those are goal categories, okay? So next we're going to talk about the SMART framework. How do you write an IEP goal? I think most IEP goals, when I look at them, I do about 500 IEP meetings a year, plus filings, state filings, due process hearings, and federal filings with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. And when I get people's paperwork from Alaska to Miami to New Hampshire to San Diego, the first thing that I see is they're not tied to the present levels. And what do I mean by that? So in the beginning of the document, we write present levels. Depending on where you are in the United States, it's called the PLAP, a PLOP, or PLAF, present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Our requirement is to make the goal SMART. And most of you guys know the acronym, right? Specific, measurable, attainable, reasonable, and timeline. We're going to tease those out in a second. But I think the biggest problem what I see in special education is the IEP goal is one, either somebody pushed a button because it's in the software. It says, hey, Matt is a fourth grader in math. I need a math goal. And so that teacher or that school-based member pushes that button. And in the software, fourth grade math goal comes up. Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But that's not a special ed goal. That is what? That's a state standard, right? So there's an onus, a duty and responsibility on the LEA, the local education agency, then to take that state standard and look back at the students' present levels and say, where is the gap, right? Because of the gap, the need, the deficit is why I'm writing an IEP goal, right? If there's no deficit, I don't need a goal, right? So I see most IEP goals are focused on the finish line. And really, we're required to focus on the baseline and then what is expectation and rate of progress. So I want you to write that down, expectation and rate of progress. Keep those two words paramount when you're writing kids' IEP goals, because without them, we're doing a terrible job of guessing. And we're writing IEP goals that are not achievable and certainly not sustainable over time, okay? So let's look at the SMART framework. So the SMART framework says that the goal is specific. So specific means specific. And I try to say things that people can understand. If you got a prescription on the bottle, does it say, you know what, Bob, just take them when you feel like it? No, it doesn't say that. It's very specific. So Deanne, it's expectation and rate of progress, expectation and rate of progress. So prescription is very specific, even though it's a little tiny, tiny label. When teachers, if you're school-based members, if you're going to be out for 2 weeks because your school district is sending you on a cruise to Rome and Greece, which probably happens all the time, what would you leave those other teachers? You would leave them very detailed notes of how to run your class, how to work with children, what to expect, what you could do to mitigate something if it arises, right? If you were a parent and you're going out of town for a week and you have your cousin who's coming to watch your kiddos, you wouldn't just go, here's my Visa card, good luck. I mean, I hope you wouldn't say that, right? You would leave them a very, 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 probably too much information to take care of your kid for a week. That's what our present levels need to look like in our document. And they don't, they're just not good, right? So the present level should identify the student's baseline. So what does that mean, Karen? So Billy has struggles in math. Okay, struggle, is that specific? I don't know what that means. He might struggle because he can't find his pencil in math. He might struggle in math because he doesn't know what greater than means. He might struggle in math because it's too loud in math. So you've got to be specific about why we're writing this goal. And that should sit in the present levels. So what is the specificity of the deficit and what does it look like in that content area? So if we're going to say, let's do a reading goal, that's easier. So we're going to say that, Billy's reading at a level B, but he's a second grader, right? Well, second graders should be reading at the end of second grade at M or N. That's a pretty big gap. So we're going to say by the middle of third grade, he's going to read at M. What is that based on? Is that based on expectation and rate of progress? No, it's just based on another year. So you have to base it on the baseline. What is his baseline? It took him, so if he's a second grader, now I'm doing math, and he's 7, it took him 7 years to read at a level B. That's like day 1, day 100 of kindergarten for some kiddos, or the very beginning of first grade. So if it took him 6 years to get there, what is it going to take for him to really double that? That's how you have to think about it, right? It took him all of these years to get here. It wouldn't matter if you were the reading teacher all day long. The rate of expectation and probability is that he's going to increase by what measure? And so you sit down with the committee and you talk that out. Hey, Mrs. Smith, you're the reading specialist. Based on Billy's level B now, and that's independent or instructional, you want to tease that out. What is the probability of what he would be in one grading period? And sometimes that's easier, right? Ask the person providing that instruction, is it likely that he's going to go up to a level H? No, that's not going to happen in 9 weeks, in 45 school days. That's not going to happen. What could we expect, Miss Reading Specialist? We could expect his WCPMs to improve, his words correct per minute. We could expect his reading comprehension to improve. We could expect his basic reading to improve. So those sorts of things I want to measure. I don't really care about your reading level going up. And if you're a reading specialist, forgive me, right? I care about those components that phonemic awareness and decoding, basic reading skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension. I expect that to go up when I'm measuring an IEP goal for reading. Because if I work on those skills inside of reading, then the expectation would be that the rate and the measure is going to improve. Does that make sense? And so then based on that, you might put in 36 instructional weeks, we believe that when he works on decoding and phonemic awareness, that his words correct per minute might go from 36 words correct per minute to 52 words correct per minute. And if you're doing that, the other numbers are going to raise, right? Instead of the IEP goals that I see that in 36 instructional weeks, Billy will increase his reading level. That's increase is not measurable. It is immeasurable. Okay. So that's part of the components of what we're looking about for specificity. Other things that I do not want you to put at the beginning of the goal is to list 7 of his accommodations. Billy, when given extra time, frequent breaks, reminders to stay on task, redirection, and then the goal. There's no need to put all of those accommodations, or what you're doing is you're putting some of the accommodations in his IEP goals. The accommodations sit on the accommodations page. You don't additionally have to put them in the IEP goal. Also, if you start to put some of the accommodations in the IEP goal, let's say you put 4, but he has 11 accommodations, are you denying him his accommodations? So I don't recommend that. You could put after receiving direct, this is how I start out a goal. In 36 instructional weeks or at the end of the IEP year, however you want to say it, wherever you live, after direct and explicit instruction, write that down. After direct and explicit instruction, you're going to need to say that. Why? That puts an onus on the campus. Most IEP goals have never include anything about the campus or the teacher. It just says Billy will. He just will. Okay. So the IEP goal is completely on him. If you put direct and explicit instruction, that assumes what the law intended is that he's going to receive direct and explicit instruction, SDI, specially designed instruction. So I want you to write in the beginning of the goal after direct and explicit instruction. I don't have to say Mrs. Smith. I don't have to say the reading specialist. I don't have to say his special ed teacher and para, just after direct and explicit instruction. Okay. And next, is it measurable? What am I measuring? Sometimes I get an IEP goal and it's just like in the beginning, it's like 85 paragraphs. He will do this while facing Northwest during football season with one purple sock halfway scrunched down while increasing his reading, while using genres with correct pronunciation, capitalization, and punctuation. I'm like, what? So the IEP goal should have one skill that I'm targeting and one strategy that I'm teaching. Just one, right? If you're putting 85 things in the annual goal, then he has to meet all 85 of those things to get the measurement to pass the goal. So this is what I'll say to the teacher, Miss Cox, if you could just do one thing with Billy in reading, what would that one thing be? And I promise you, every time she has the answer. Ask her. You don't have to. It's not like I show up with a goal and then you show up a goal. It's not some shootout, right? We talk about the goal and craft it as a team together. So if for some reason you can only teach Billy one thing in reading, what would it be? I promise you the teacher immediately will have the answer because she teaches him, right? You also need to know that teachers don't usually write IEP goals. Somebody else is usually writing them and they're in the software. Teachers didn't go to school to write IEP goals. They went to school because they love kids and they can teach them. And so here's the other thing I'll say. I'll say, Miss Cox, so just forget the goal. Just forget the goal, right? Just tell me when you're working with Billy in reading, because when I'm working with Billy in reading, he throws his book on the floor, even if we've had a snack and I gave him a break, he's not having it. Do you still see that at school? And she will say, yes, I see that at school, because that's Billy, right? And I will say, when you're working with him in reading, tell me what you do. Tell me what you do. Or I'll say, tell me what that looks like. And she'll describe what she's doing. Tell me what that looks like is very different than, could you write Billy an IEP goal? Right? They're two different things. Of course she can describe what she's doing. That's what she does. But if you told me to teach a class on how I got ready to do this, that would be very weird for me. But if you ask me, what do you do? If you just made write down, what do you do to get ready for this? I can tell you what I do. But when you ask somebody to write down a goal, that's where the gap comes in. So I'm going to ask her what she does, and she'll explain it to me. And then I'll say, hey, Miss Johnson, you're taking notes. That everything that she just said, let's make that a goal, because she's already doing that. And what? It's effectual. Okay. Next, the SMART framework is specific, measurable, attainable. Let's switch the A out in special ed for appropriate. Let's make it appropriate. And appropriate based on what? So the law says in Andrew F., March 22nd, 2017, the U.S. Supreme Court decision, Andrew F. versus Douglas County, the Supreme Court ruling, which is the law of the land, says that the school is charged with writing an IEP to make able the student to make progress in light of their unique circumstances. So their unique circumstances, knowing that, is what gets you to appropriate. Appropriate is the big A in FAPE, a free appropriate public education. So what's appropriate for him? If it's appropriate that he goes up from a level B to a level D, I'm fine with that. If it's appropriate that after one goal, 1 year, he'll improve 10%, I'm fine with that. We don't have to get stuck on the 70%. So these standards or habits, kind of bad habits of writing IEP goals, we're not tied to. If we want to write an IEP goal that in 36 instructional weeks, he will only break 2 pencils a week instead of 6, then that can be an IEP goal. We can write IEP goals based on his unique circumstances that we're going to enable him to make progress in light of them. Next is reasonable. What is reasonable? So reasonable, is it reasonable for the student with the disability? Is it reasonable that the person that's delivering the direct and explicit instruction can work on that skill and strategy? And is it reasonable based on rate of expectation and rate of progress that that's going to happen? Is this reasonable? Well, he needs to get there. That's not in the law. He needs to get there. Thank goodness. Right? Well, that's the 4th grade standard, not in the law, right? What is reasonable for this student based on the totality of how he presents? And then last but not least, time. And the time constraint are federal and state law. Those don't move. So the annual goal has to be for 36 instructional weeks. If we write a goal, let's say that his annual IEP meeting started November 5th, like we talked about, he's just rocking it out. And we come back in February and we get rid of this reading goal and we write a totally different one. We can see now that his deficit actually really isn't dyslexia and basic reading, but it really is about fluency. Then we can write a new goal. Obviously, that's going to stop in a shorter timeline. The timelines are tied to the annual goal. Additionally, I want to make sure that you are remembering that we're not writing IEP goals outside of 36 instructional weeks. I know it seems exciting, doesn't it? But the law requires us to write, craft, and make an IEP or IEP goals based on 36 instructional weeks. And that's it. Why, Karen? Because anything outside of that would be predetermination. I have committees that sometimes want to talk about the state testing, which, I love state testing, said no one. And they'll want to talk about state testing for the next year. And I said, I have a crystal ball that's in the shop, not expected to be repaired. So anything outside of 36 instructional weeks, whether you're the parent, the advocate, an attorney, or anybody, is outside of our purview and our requirements and our ability to instruct a student with a disability. So those are IEP goals and how you craft them. Please go back and look at your kiddo, look at your kids, look at your whoever you're the guardian of, and look at their document and say, is this goal even tied to their present levels? Is there a need that didn't show up in their present levels that would then give birth to an IEP goal? And have I looked at all of these areas: communication, social, emotional, functional? I wish kids just needed help in academics. That's not true. They need help in all areas, just like adults need help in all areas, and we can provide that direct and explicit instruction to mitigate and help them learn strategy and skills around the acuity of their disability. So thank you guys. Hit subscribe, share this with a friend, and you know what? Meet me back here every single week. We're not just talking about change, we're making it. Because when you know better, you do better. And when we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody.